Incredible Adventures by Algernon Blackwood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Patrick79. Part 6. And next day broke as soft and brilliant as though October had stolen it from June. The Alps gleamed through an almost summery haze across the lake. The air held no hint of coming winter, and the Jura mountains wore the true blue of memory in Hendrix's mind. Patches of red and yellow splashed the great pine woods here and there, where beech and ash put autumn in the vast dark carpet. The tutor woke clear-headed and refreshed. All that had happened the night before seemed out of proportion and unreasonable. There had been exaggerated emotion in it. In himself, because he returned to a place still charged with potent memories of youth, and in Lord Ernie, because the lad was overwrought by the electrical disturbance of the atmosphere. The nearness of the ancestral halls which they both disliked had emphasized it. The ominous wild weather had favoured it, and the coincidence of these pagan rites of superstitious peasants had focussed it all into a melodramatic form, with an added touch of the supernatural that was highly picturesque and, dangerously suggestive. Hendrix recovered his common sense. Judgment asserted itself again. Yet, for all that, certain things remained authentic. The effect upon the boy was not illusion, nor his words about fire and wind mere meaningless invention. There hid some undivined and significant correspondence between the gaps in his deficient nature and these two turbulent elements. The talk with Leysin, as the conduct of his wife, remained authentic. Those facts were too steady to be dismissed. The pastor too genuinely in earnest to be catalogued in dream. Neither daylight nor common sense could dissipate their actuality. Truth lay somewhere in it all. Thus the day for the tutor was a battle that shifted with varying fortune between doubt and certainty. In the morning his mind was decided. The wild experiment was unjustifiable. In the afternoon, as the sunshine grew faint and melancholy, it became interesting, for what harm could come of it? But towards evening, when shadows lengthened across the purple forests and the trees stood motionless in the calm and windless air, the adventure seemed, as it had seemed the night before, not only justifiable, but right and necessary. It only became inevitable, however, when after tea together on the balcony, Lord Ernie, mentioning the subject for the first time that day, asked pointedly what time the pastor expected them to supper. Then, noticing the flash of hesitancy in his companion's eyes, added in his strange deep voice, "You promised we should go." Withdrawal after that was out of the question. To retract would have meant, for one thing, final loss of the boy's confidence, a possibility not to be contemplated for a moment. Until this moment no word of the preceding night had passed the lips of either. Lord Ernie had been quiet and preoccupied, silent rather, but never listless. He was peaceful, perhaps subdued a little, yet with a suppressed energy in his bearing that Hendrix watched with secret satisfaction. The tutor, closely observant, detected nothing out of gear. Life stirred strongly in him. There was purpose, interest, will. There was desire, but there was nothing to cause alarm. Availing himself then of the lad's absorption in his own affairs, he wandered forth alone upon his sentimental tour of inspection. No ghost of emotion rose to stalk beside him. That early tragedy, he now saw clearly, had been no more than youthful explosion of mere physical passion, wholesome and natural, but due chiefly to propinquity. His thoughts ran idly on, and he was even congratulating himself upon escape and freedom when, abruptly, he remembered a phrase Bindy had used the night before, and stumbled suddenly upon a clue when least expecting it. He came to a sudden halt. The significance of it crashed through his mind and startled him. There are big women. It was the first reference to the other sex, as evidence of their attraction for him, Hendricks had ever known to pass his lips. Hitherto, though 20 years of age, the lad had never spoken of women as though he was aware of their terrible magic. He had not discovered them as females necessary to every healthy male. It was not purity, of course, but ignorance. He had felt nothing. Something had now awakened sex in him, so that he knew himself a man, and naked. And it had revolutionized the world for him. This new life came from the roots, transforming listless indifference into positive desire. The will woke out of sleep, and all the torrents of his system took aggressive form, for all energy, intellectual, emotional, or spiritual, is fundamentally one. It is primarily sexual. Hendricks paused in his sentimental walk, marvelling that he had not realized sooner this simple truth. It brought a certain logical meaning even into the pagan rites upon the mountains, these ancient rites which symbolized the marriage of the two tremendous elements of wind and fire, heat and air. And the lad's quiet, busy mood that morning confirmed his simple discovery. It involved restraint and purpose. Lord Ernie was alive. Hendricks would take home with him to those ancestral halls a vessel bursting with energy, creative energy. It was admirable that he should witness, from a safe distance, this primitive ceremony of crude pagan origin. It was the very thing. And the tutor hurried back to the house among the vineyards, aware that his responsibility had increased, but persuaded more than ever that his course was justified. The sky held calm and cloudless through the day, the forest brooding beneath the hazy autumn sunshine. Indications that the second hurricane lay brewing among the heights were not wanting, however, to experienced eyes. Almost a preternatural silence reigned. There was a warm heaviness in the placid atmosphere. The surface of the lake was patched and streaky, the extreme clarity of the air an ominous omen. Distant objects were too close. Towards sunset, moreover, the streaks and patches vanished as though sucked below, while thin strips of tenuous cloud appeared from nowhere above the northern cliffs. They moved with great rapidity at the enormous height, touched with a lurid brilliance as the sun sank out of sight. And when Hendricks strolled over with Lord Ernie to La Cure for supper, there came a sudden rush of heated wind that set the branches sharply rattling, then died away as abruptly as it rose. They seemed reflected, too, these disturbances, in the human atmospheres about the supper table. There was suppression of various emotions presaging violence. Lord Ernie was exhilarated, Hendricks uneasy and preoccupied, the pastor grave and thoughtful. In Hendricks was another feeling as well, that he had lightly summoned a storm which might carry him off his feet. The boy's excitement increased it, as wind puffs fan a starting fire. His own judgment had somewhere played him false, betraying into this incredible adventure, and yet he could not stop it. The pastor's influence was over him, perhaps. He was ashamed to turn back. He was committed. The unusual circumstances found the weakness in his character. For somewhere in the preposterous supposition there lay a big forgotten truth. He could not believe it, and yet he did believe it. The world had forgotten how to live truly close to nature. A desultory conversation was carried on, chiefly between the two men, while the boy ate hungrily, and Madame Lezan watched her husband with anxiety as she served the simple meal.
"So you are coming with us, and you like to come?"
the pastor observed quietly, Hendricks translating. Lord Ernie replied with a gesture of unmistakable enthusiasm.
"A wild lot of men and women," Lezan went on, keeping his eye hard upon him, "with an interesting worship of their own, copied from very ancient times. They live on the heights, and mix little with us valley folk. You shall see their ceremonies tonight."
"They get the wind and fire into themselves, don't they?" asked the boy keenly, and somewhat to the distress of the translator, who rendered it, "They get into wind and fire."
"They worship wind and fire," Lezan replied, "and they do it by means of a wonderful dance that somehow imitates the leap of flame and a headlong rush of wind. If you copy the movements and gestures of a person, you discover the emotion that causes them. You share it. Their idea is, apparently, that by imitating the movements they invite or attract the force, draw these elemental powers into their systems, so that in the end—" He stopped suddenly, catching the tutor's eye. Lord Ernie seemed to understand without translation. He had laid down his knife and fork, and was leaning forward across the table, listening with deep absorption. His expression was alert with a new intelligence that was almost cunning. An acute sensibility seemed to have awakened in him. "As with laughing, I suppose," he said in an undertone to Hendricks quickly. "If you imitate laughter, you laugh yourself in the end and feel all the jolly excitement of laughter. Is that what he means?" The tutor nodded with assumed indifference. "Imitation is always infectious," he said lightly. "But, of course, you will not imitate these wild people yourself, Bindy. We will just look on from a distance."
"From a distance?" repeated the boy, obviously disappointed. "What's the good of that?" A look of obstinacy passed across his altered face. Hendricks met his eye squarely. "At a circus," he said firmly, "you just watch. You don't imitate the clown, do you?" "If you look long enough, you do," was the rather dogged reply. "Well, take the Russian dancers we saw in Moscow," the other insisted patiently. "You felt the power and beauty without jumping up and whirling in your stall?" Bindy half glared at him. There was almost contempt in his quiet answer. "But your mind whirled with them, and later your body would too. Otherwise it's given you nothing." He paused a second. "I can only get fun of riding by being on a horseback and doing his movements exactly with him, not by watching him." Hendricks smiled and shrugged his shoulders. He did not wish to discourage the enthusiasm lying behind this analysis. The uneasiness in him grew apace. He said something rapidly in French, using an undertone and laughter to confuse the actual words.
"Of course, we must not interfere with their ceremonies," put in the pastor with decision. "It's sacred to them. We can hide among the trees and watch. You would not leave your seat in church to imitate the priest, now would you? He glanced smilingly at the eager youth before him. If he did something real, I would. It was said with a bright flash in his eyes. Anything real I'd copy like a shot, only I never find it. The reply was disconcerting rather, and Hendricks, as he hurriedly translated, made a clatter with a knife and fork, for something in him rose to meet the truth behind the curious words. From that moment, as though catching a little of the boy's exhilaration, he passed under a kind of spell, perhaps. It was, in spite of the exaggeration, oddly stimulating. This dull little meal at the village cure masked an accumulating vehemence, eager to break loose. He heard the old father's voice. Well done, Hendricks. You have accomplished wonders. He would take back the boy alive. Yet all the time there were streaks and patches on his soul, as upon the surface of the lake that afternoon. There were signs of terror. He felt himself letting go, an increasing recklessness, a yielding up more and more of his own authority to that of this triumphant boy. Bindy understood the meaning of it all and felt secure. Hendricks faltered, hesitated, stood on the defensive. Yet ever less and less, already he accepted the other's guidance. Already Lord Ernie's leadership was in the ascendant. Conviction invariably holds dominion over doubt. They ate little. It was near the end of the meal when the wind, falling from a clear and starlit sky, struck its first violent blow, dropping with the force of an explosion that shook the wooden house, and passing with a roar towards the distant lake. The oil lamp, suspended from the ceiling, trembled. The pastor looked apprehensively at the shuttered windows, and Lord Ernie, with startling abruptness, stood up. His eyes were shining, his voice was brisk, alert, and deep. The wind, he cried. Think what it'll be up there. We shall feel it on our bodies. His enthusiasm was like a rush of air across the table. And the fire, he went on. The flames will lick all over and tear about the sky. I feel the wild and full of them already. How splendid! And the flame of the little lamp leaped higher in the chimney as he said it. The violence of the coup de joran is extraordinary, explained Leysin as he got up to turn down the wick. And the second outburst. The rest of the sentence was drowned by the noise of Hendricks's voice, telling the boy to sit down and finish his supper. And at the same moment the pastor's wife came in, as though a stroke of wind drove behind her down the passage. The door slammed in the draught. There was a momentary confusion in the room, above which her voice rose shrill and frightened. The fires are alight, Jules, she whispered in her half-intelligible patois. The forest is burning all along the upper ridge. Her face was pale and her speech was stumbling. She lowered her lips to her husband's ear. They'll be looking out for recruits tonight. Is it necessary? Is it right for you to go? She glanced uneasily at the English visitors. You know the danger. He stopped her with a gesture. Those who look on at life accomplish nothing, he answered impatiently. One must act, always act. Chances are sent to be taken, not stared at. He rose, pushing past her into the passage, and as he did so she gave him one swift, comprehensive look of tenderness and admiration, then hurried after him to find his hat and cloak. Willingly she would have kept him at home that night, yet gladly, in another sense, she saw him go. She fumbled in her movements, ready to laugh or cry or pray. Hendricks saw her pain and understood. It was singular how the woman's attitude intensified his own misgivings. Her behaviour, the mere expression of her face alone, made the adventure so absolutely real. 3 minutes later they were in the village street. Hendricks and Lord Ernie, the latter impatient in the road beyond, saw her tall figure stoop to embrace him. "I shall pray all night. I shall watch from my window for your return. God, who speaks from the whirlwind, and whose pathway is the fire, will go with you. Remember the younger men. It is ever the younger men that they seek to take." Her words were half hysterical. The kiss was given and taken. The open doorway framed her outline a moment. Then the buttress of the church blotted her out, and they were off. End of part 6. Incredible Adventures by Algernon Blackwood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Patrick79. Story 1. The Regeneration of Lord Ernie. Part 7. And at once the curious confusion of strong wind was upon them. Gusts howled about the corners of the shuttered houses, and tore noiselessly across the open yards. Dust whirled with a rapidity as of some spectral white machinery. A tile came clattering down about their feet, while overhead the roofs had an air of shifting, toppling, bending. The entire village seemed scooped up and shaken, then dropped upon the earth again in tottering fashion. "This way," gasped the little pastor, blown sideways like a sail. "Follow me closely." Almost arm in arm at first they hurried down the deserted street, past lampless windows and tight-fastened doors, and soon they were beyond the cabaret in that open stretch between the village and the forest where the wind had unobstructed way. Far above them ran the fiery mountain edge. They saw the glare reflected in the sky as the tempest first swept them all three together, then separated them in the same moment. They seemed to spin or whirl. "It's far worse than I expected," shouted their guide. "Here, give me your hand." Then found, once disentangled from his flapping coat, that no one stood beside him. For each of them it was a single fight to reach the shelter of the woods, where the actual ascent began. An instant the pastor seemed to hesitate. He glanced back at the lighted windows of La Cure across the fields, at the line of fire in the sky, at the figure disappearing in the blackness immediate ahead. "Where's the boy?" he shouted. "Don't let him get too far in front. Keep close. Wait till I come." They staggered back against each other. "Look how easily he's slipped ahead already." "This howling wind!" Hendricks shouted as they advanced side by side, pushing their shoulders against the storm. The rest of the sentence vanished into space. Leysin shoved him forward, pointing to where, some 20 yards in front, the figure of Lord Ernie, head down, was battling eagerly with the hurricane. Already he stood near the shelter of the trees, waving his arms with energy towards the summits where the fire blazed. He was calling something at the top of his voice, urging them to hurry. His voice rushed down upon them with a pelt of wind. "Don't let him get away from us," bawled Leysin, holding his hands cup-wise to his mouth. "Keep him in reach. He may see, but must not take part." A blow full in the face that smote him like the flat of a great sword clapped the sentence short. "That's your part! He won't obey me!" Hendricks heard it as they plunged across the wind-swept reach, panting, struggling, forcing their bodies sideways like two-legged crabs against the terrific force of the descending joran. They reached the protection of the forest wall without further attempt at speech. Here there was a sudden peace and silence, for the tall, dense trees received the tempest impact like a cushion, stopping it. They paused a moment to recover breath, but although the first exhaustion speedily passed, that original confusion of strong wind remained, in Hendricks' mind at least, for wind violent enough to be battled with has a scarring effect on thoughts and blows the very blood about. Something in him snapped its cables and blew out to sea. His breath drew in an impetuous quality from the tempest each time he filled his lungs. There was agitation in him that caused an odd exaggeration of the emotions. The boy, as they came up, leaped down from the boulder he had climbed. He opened his arms, making of his cloak a kind of sail that filled and flapped. "At last!" he cried, impatient, almost vexed. "I thought you were never coming. The wind blew me along. We shall be late." The tutor caught his arm with vigour. "Now you keep by us, Ernest. Do you hear now? No rushing ahead like that. Leysan's the guide, not you." He even shook him, but as he did so he was aware that he himself resisted something that he did not really want to resist, something that urged him forcibly. A little more he would yield to it with pleasure, with abandon, finally with recklessness. A reaction of panic fear ran over him. "It was the wind, I tell you," cried the boy, flinging himself free with a hint of insolence in his voice. "For it's alive. I mean to see everything. The wind's our leader and the fire's our guide." He made a movement to start on again. "You'll obey me," thundered Hendricks, "or else you go home. Do you understand?" With exasperation, yet with uneasy delight, he noted the words Bindy made use of. It was in him that he might also have uttered them himself. He stepped already into an entirely new world. Exhilaration caught him even now. Putting the brake on was mere pretence. He seized the lad by both shoulders and pushed him to the rear, then placed himself next, so that Leysan moved in front and led the way. The procession started, diving into the comparative shelter of the forest. "Don't let him pass you," he heard in rapid French. "Guide him, that's all. The power's already in his blood. Keep yourself in hand as well, and follow me closely." The roar of the storm above them carried the words clean off the world. Here in the forest they moved, it seemed, along the floor of an ocean whose surface raged with dreadful violence. Any moment one or other of them might be caught up at that surface and whirled off to destruction. For the procession was not one of itself. The darkness, the difficulty of hearing what each said, the feeling, too, that each climbed for himself, made everything seem at sixes and sevens. And the tutor, this secret exultation growing in his heart, denied the anxiety that kept its pace, and battled with his turbulent emotions. A divided personality. His power over the boy, he realized, had gravely weakened. A little time ago they had seemed somehow equal. Now, however, a complete reversal of their relative positions had taken place. The boy was sure of himself. While Leysin led at a steady mountaineer's pace on his wiry, short-bowed legs, Hendricks, a yard or two behind him, stumbled a good deal in the darkness. Lord Ernie forever on his heels, eager to push past. But Bindy never stumbled. There was no flagging in his muscles. He moved so lightly and with so sure a tread that he almost seemed to dance, and often he stopped aside to leap a boulder or to run along a fallen trunk. Path there was none. Occasional gusts of winds rushed gustily down into these depths of forest where they moved, and now, from time to time, as they rose nearer to the line of fire on the ridge, an increasing glare lit up the knuckled roots or glimmered on the bramble thickets and heavy beds of moss. It was astonishing how the little pastor never missed his way. Periods of thick silence alternated with moments when the storm swept down through the gullies, among the trees, reverberating like thunder in the hollows. Slowly they advanced, buffeted, driven, pushed, the wildness of some Walpurgis night growing upon all three. In the tutor's mind was this strange lift of increasing recklessness. The old proportion was gone, the spiritual aspect of it troubling him to the point of sheer distress. He followed Leysin as blindly with his body as he followed this new Bindy eagerly with his mind. For this languid boy, now dancing to the tune of flooding life at his very heels, seemed magical in the true sense, energy created by a wizard out of nothing. From lips that ordinarily sighed in listless boredom poured now a ceaseless stream of questions and ejaculations ringing with enthusiasm. How long would it take to reach the fiery ridge? Why did they go so slowly? Would they arrive too late? Would their intrusion be welcomed or understood? Already one great change was effected, accepted by Hendricks too, that the role of mere spectator was impossible. The answers Hendricks gave, indeed, grew more and more encouraging and sympathetic. He, too, was impatient of their leader's crawling pace. Some elemental spell of wind and fire urged him towards the open ridge. The pull became irresistible. He despised the pastor's caution, denied his wisdom, wholly rejected now the spirit of compromise and prudence. And once, as the hurricane brought down a flying burst of voices, he caught himself leaping upon a big grey boulder in their path. He leaped at the very moment that the boy behind him leaped, yet hardly realized that he did so. His feet danced without a conscious order from his brain. They met together on the rounded top, stumbled, clutched one another frantically, then slid with waving arms and flying cloaks down the slippery surface of damp moss, laughing wildly. "You fool!" cried Hendricks, saving himself. "What in the world?" "You called," laughed Bindy, picking himself up and dropping back to his place in the rear again. "It's the wind. It's not me. It's in our feet. Half the time you're shouting and jumping yourself." And it was a few minutes after this that Lord Ernie suddenly forged ahead. He slipped in front as silently as a shadow before a moving candle in a room, passing the tutor at a moment when his feet were entangled among roots and stones. He easily overtook the pastor and found himself in the lead. He never stumbled. There seemed steel springs in his legs. From Leysin, too breathless to interfere, came a cry of warning. "Stop him! Take his hand!" His tired voice instantly smothered by the roaring skies. He turned to catch Hendricks by the cloak. "You see that?" he shouted in alarm. For the love of God, don't lose sight of him. He must see, but not take part. Remember!" And Hendricks yelled after the vanishing figure, "Bindi, go slow! Go slow! Keep in touch with us!" But he quickened his pace instantly, as though to overtake the boy. He passed his companion the same minute and was out of sight. "I'll wait for you!" came back the boy's shrill answer through the thinning trees, and a flare of light fell with it from the sky, for the final climb of the steep 500 feet had now begun, and overhead the naked ridge ran east and west with its line of blazing fires. Boulders and rocky ground replaced the pines and spruces. "But you'll never find the way," shouted Leysin, while a deep trumpeting roar of the storm beyond muffled the remainder of the sentence. Hendricks heard the next words close beside him from a clump of shadows. He was in touching distance of the excited boy. "The fires and the singing guide me. Only a fool could miss the way." "But you are a—" He swallowed the unuttered word. A new, extraordinary respect was suddenly in him. That tall, virile figure, instinct with life, springing so cleverly through the choking darkness, guiding with decision and intelligence, almost infallible. It was no fool that led them thus. He hurried after till his very sinews ached. His eyes, troubled and confused, strained through the trees to find him. But these same trees now fled past him in a torrent. "Bindi! Bindi!" he cried at the top of his voice, yet not with the imperious tone the situation called for. The sentence dropped into a lull of wind. Instead of command, there was entreaty, almost supplication in it. "Wait for me! I'm coming! We'll see the glorious thing together!" And then suddenly the forest lay behind him, with a belt of open pasture land in front, below the actual ridge. He felt the first great draught of heat, as a line of furnaces burst their doors with a mighty roar and turned the sky into a blaze of golden daylight. There was a crackling as of musketry. The flare shot up and burned the air about him, and the voices of a multitude, as yet invisible, drove through it like projectiles of the wind. This was the first impression, wholesale and terrific, that met him as he paused an instant on the edge of the sheltering forest and looked forward. Leysin and Lord Ernie seemed to leave his mind, forgotten in this first attack of splendour, but forgotten, as it were, the first with contempt, the latter with an overwhelming regret. For the pastor's mistake in that instant seemed obvious. In half measures lay the fatal error, and in compromise the danger. Bindi all along had known the better way and followed it. The lukewarm was the worthless. "Bindi, boy, where are you? I'm coming!" And stepping onto the grassy strip of ground, soft to his feet, he met a wind that fell upon his body with a shower of blows from all directions at once, and beat him to his knees. He dropped, it seemed, into the cover of a sheltering rock, for there followed then a moment of sudden and delicious stillness, in which the weary muscles recovered themselves, and thought grew slightly steadier. Crouched thus, close to the earth, he no longer offered a target to the hurricane's attack. He peered upward, making a screen of his hands. The ridge, some 50 feet above him,
he saw ran in a generous platform along the mountain crest. It was wide and flat. Between the enormous fires of piled-up wood that stretched for half a mile coiled a medley of dense smoke and tearing sparks. No human beings were visible, and yet he was aware of crowding life quite near. On hands and knees, crawling painfully, he then slowly retreated again into the shelter of the forest he had sought to leave. He stood up. The awful blaze was veiled by the roof of branches once more. But as he rose, seizing a sapling to steady himself by, two hands caught him with violence from behind, and a familiar voice came shouting against his ear. Leysin, panting, dishevelled, and half-broken with speed, stood beside him.
"The boy! Where is he? We're just in time."
He roared the words to make them carry above the din.
"Hurry! Hurry! I'll follow. My old legs. See, for the love of God, that he is not taken. Now I have warned you."
And for a second, as he heard, Hendricks caught at the vanished sense of responsibility again. He saw the face of the old Marquis watching him among the trees. He heard his voice, amazed, reproachful, furious.
"It was criminal of you. Criminal! Where is the boy? Your boy?"
Again broke in the shout of the pastor with a slap of hurricane, as he staggered against the tutor, half collapsing and trying to point the direction.
"Watch him! Find him, for the love of heaven, before it is too late! Before they see him!"
The tutor's normal, responsible self dived out of sight again as he heard the cry of weakness and alarm. It seemed the wind got under him, lifting him bodily from his feet. He did not pause to think. Like a man midway in a whirling prize-fight, he felt dazed but confident, only conscious of one thing, that he must hold out to the end, take part in all the splendid fighting, win. The lust of the arena, the pride of youth and battle, the impetuous recklessness of the charge in primitive war caught at his heart, brimming it with headlong courage. To play the game for all it might be worth seemed shouted everywhere about him, as the abandon of wind and fire rushed through him like a storm. He felt lifted above all possibility of little failure. The Marquis, with his conventional traditions, the pastor with his considerations of halfway safety, both vanished utterly. Safety, indeed, both for himself and for the boy in his charge, lay in unconditional surrender. This was no time for little thought-out actions. It was all or nothing. "God bless the whirlwind and the fire!" he shouted, opening wide his arms. But his voice was inaudible amid the uproar, and the forward movement of his body remained at first only in the brain. He turned to push the old man aside, even to strike him down if necessary. "Lukewarm yourself and a coward," rose in his throat, yet found no utterance, for in that moment a tall, slim figure, swift as a shadow, steady as a hawk, shot hard across the open space between the forest and the ridge. In the direction of the blazing platform it disappeared against a curtain of thick smoke, emerged for 1 second in a storm of light, then vanished finally behind a ruin of loose rocks. And Hendricks, his eyes wounded by heat and wind, his muscles paralysed, understood that the boy deliberately invited capture. The multitude that hid behind the smoke and the fire,
feeding the blazing heaps with eager hands, had become aware of him, and presently would appear to claim him. They would take him to themselves. Already answering flares ran east and west along the desolate ridge. "I'll join you! I'm coming! Wait for me!" he tried to cry. The uproar smothered it. End of Part 7.
Incredible Adventures by Algernon Blackwood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Patrick79. Story 1. The Regeneration of Lord Ernie, Part 8. And this uproar, he now perceived, was composed entirely of wind and fire. Here on the roof of the hills beneath a starry sky, these two great elements expressed their nature with an unhampered freedom, for there was neither rain to modify the one, nor a solid obstacle to check the other. Their voices merged in a single sound, the hollow boom of wind and the deep resounding clap of flame. The splitting crackle of burning branches imitated the high, shrill whistle of the tearing gusts that, javelin-like, flew to and fro in darts of swifter sound. But one shout rose from the summit, no human cry distinguishable in it, nor amid the thousand lines of skeleton wood that pierced the golden background was any human outline visible. Fire and wind encouraged one another to madness, manifesting it in prodigious splendour by themselves. Then suddenly, before a gigantic canter of the wind, the driving smoke rolled upwards like a curtain, and the flames, ceasing their wild flappings, soared steadily in Gothic windows of living gold towards the stars. In towering rows between columns of black night, they transformed the empty space between them into a colossal temple aisle. They tapered aloft symmetrically into vanishing crests, and Hendricks stood upright, rising so that his shoulders topped the edge of the boulder, and utterly contemptuous of Leysin's hand that sought with violence to drag him into shelter. He gazed as one who sees a vision. For at first he could only stand and stare, aware of sensation, but not of thought. An enormous, overpowering conviction blew his whole being to white heat. Here was a supply of elemental power that human beings, empty, needy, starved, deficient human beings, could use. His love for the boy leaped along at the skirts of this terrific salvation. A majestic possibility stormed through him. Yet it was no nightmare wonder that met his staring and half-shielded eyes, although some touch of awful dream seemed in it, set, moreover, to a scale that scantier minds might deem distortion. The heat from some 30 fires placed at regular intervals made midnight quiver with immense vibrations. Of varying yet calculated size, these towering heaps emitted notes of measured and alternating depth, until the roar along the entire produced a definite scale, almost of melody, the near ones shrilly singing, those more distant booming with mountainous pedal notes. The consonance was monstrous, yet conformed to some magnificent diapason. This chord of fire music paced the starlit sky, direct but never overmastered by the wind that measured it somehow into meaning. Repeated in quick succession, the notes now crashing in a mass, now singing alone in solitary beauty,
The effect suggested an idea of ordered sequence, of gigantic rhythm. It seemed, indeed, as though some controlling agency, mastering excess, coerced both raging elements to express through this stupendous dance some definite idea. Here, as it were, was the alphabet of some natural, undifferentiated language, a language of sight and sound, predating speech, symbolical in the ultimate deific sense. Some lord of fire and some lord of air were in command, harnessed and regulated. These formless cohorts of energy that men call stupidly mere flame and wind obeyed a higher power that had invoked them, yet a power that, by understanding their laws of being, held them most admirably in control. This, at least, seems a hint of the explanation that flashed into Hendricks as he stared in amazed bewilderment from the shelter of the nearest boulder. He read a sentence in some natural forgotten script. He watched a primitive ritual that once invoked the gods. He was aware of rhythm, and he was aware of system, though as yet he did not see the hand that wrote this marvellous sentence on the night. For still the human element remained invisible. He only realized, in dim, blundering fashion, that he witnessed a revelation of these two powers which, in large, lie at the foundation of the universe, and in little are the basic essentials of human existence, the powers behind heat and air. Fragments of this talk with Leysin stammered back across his mind, like letters in some stupendous word he dared not reconstruct entire. He shuddered and grew wise. Realms of forgotten being opened their doors before his dazzled sight. Vision fluttered into far, piercing vistas of ancient wonder, haunting and half remembered, then lost its way in blindness that was pain. For a moment it seemed he was aware of the majestic presences behind the turmoil, shadowy but mighty, charged with a vague potentiality as of immense algebraical formulae, symbolical and beyond full comprehension, yet willing and able to be used for practical results. He felt the elements as nerves of a living universe. Yet thinking was not really in him anywhere. Feeling was all he knew. The world he moved in, as the scripts he read, belonged to conditions too utterly remote for reasons to recover a single clue to their intelligible reconstruction. Glory, clean and strong as of primitive star worship, passed between what he saw and all that he had ever known before. The curtain of conventional belief was rent in twain. The terrific thing was true. For an unmeasured interval the tutor, oblivious of time and actual place, stood on the brink of this majestic pageant, staring with breathless awe, while the swaying of the entire scenery increased, like the sway of an ocean lifted to the sky by many winds. Then suddenly, in one of those temporary lulls that pass between the beat of the great notes, his searching eyes discovered a new thing. The focus of his sight was altered, and he realized at last the source of the directing and controlling power. Behind the fires and beyond the smoke he recognized the disc-like, shining ovals that upon the little earth stand in the image of the one, eternal likeness. He saw the human faces, symbols of spiritual dominion over all lesser orders, each one possessed of belief, intelligence, and will. Singly so feeble, together so invincible, this assemblage, unscorched by the fire and by the wind unmoved, seemed to him impressive beyond all possible words, and a further inkling of the truth flashed on him as he stared. That a group of humans, a crowd, combining upon a given object with concentrated purpose, possessed of that terrific power, certain faith, may know in themselves the energy and move mountains, and therefore that lesser energy to guide the fluid forces of the elements. And a sense of cosmic exaltation leaped into his being. For a moment he knew a touch of almost frenzy. Proud joy rose in him like a splendour of omnipotence. Humanity, it seemed to him, here came into a grand but long neglected corner of its kingdom, as originally planned by heaven. Into the hands of a weakling and deficient boy the guidance had been given. Motionless beneath the stars, lit by the glare till they shone like idols of yellow stone, and magnified by the sheets of flying, intolerable light the wind chased to and fro, these rows of faces appeared at first as a single line of undifferentiated fire against the background of the night. The eyes were all cast down in prayer, each mind focused steadily upon one clear idea, the control and assimilation of two elemental powers. The crowd was one, feeling was one, desire, command, and certain faith were one. The controlling power that resulted was irresistible. Then came a remarkable, concerted movement. With one accord, the eyes all opened, blazing with reflected fire. 100 human countenances rose in a single shining line. The men stood upright, swarthy faces, tanned by the sun and wind, heads uncovered, hair and beards tossing in the air, turned all one way. Mouths open too. There came a roar that even the hurricane could not drown. A word of command, it seemed, that sprang into the pulses of the dancing elements and reduced their turmoil to a wave of steadier movement. And at the same moment 100 bodies, naked above the waist, arms outstretched and hands with the palms held upwards, swayed forward through the smoke and fire. They came towards the spot where, half concealed from view, the tutor crouched and watched. And Hendricks, thinking himself discovered, first quailed, then rose to meet them. No power to resist was in him. It was rather willing response that he experienced. He stepped out from the shelter of the boulder and entered the brilliant glare. Hatless himself, shoulders squared, cloak flying in the wind, he took 3 strides towards the advancing battalion. Then, undecided, paused, for the line he saw disregarded him as though he were not there at all. It was not him the worshippers sought. The entire troop swept past to a point some 50 feet below, where the edge of the ridge broke out of the thinning trees. Beautiful as a curving wave of flame, the figures streamed across the narrow open space with a drilled precision as of some battle line, and Hendricks, with a sense of wild, secret triumph, saw them pause at the brink of the platform ridge, form up their serried ranks, yet closer, then open 200 arms to welcome someone whom the darkness should immediately deliver. Simultaneously, from the covering trees, the tall, slim shadow of Lord Ernie darted out into the light. "Magnificent!" cried Hendricks, but his voice was smothered instantly in a mightier sound, and his movement forward seemed ineffective and stumbling. The 100 voices thundered out a single note, and like a deer the boy leaped. Like a tongue of flame he flew to join his own. and instantly was surrounded, borne shoulder high upon those upturned palms, swept back in triumph towards the procession of enormous fires. Wrapped by smoke and sparks, lifted by wind, he became part of the monstrous rhythm that turned the mountain ridge alive. He stood upright upon the platform of the interlacing arms. He swayed with their movement as a thing of wind and fire that flew. The shining faces vanished then, turned all towards the blazing piles, so that the boy had the appearance of standing on a wall of living black. His outline was visible a moment against the sky, firelight between the wide-stretched legs, streaming from his hair and horizontal arms, issuing almost, as it seemed, from his very body. The next second he leaped to the ground, ran forward, appallingly close, between two heaped-up fires, flung both hands heavenwards, and knelt. And Hendricks, sympathetically following the boy's performance, as though his own mind and body took part in it, experienced then a singular result. It seemed the heart in him began to roar. This was no rustle of excited blood that the little cavern of his skull increased, but a deeper sound that proclaimed the kinship of his entire being with the ritual. His own nature had begun to answer. From that moment he perceived the spectacle, not with the senses of sight and hearing separately, but with his entire body, synthetically. He became a part of this assembly that was itself one single instrument, a cosmic sounding board for the rhythmical expression of impersonal nature powers. Leysin, he dimly realized, fixed in his churchy tenets, remained outside, apart and compromising. Hendricks accepted and went with. All little customary feelings dipped utterly away, lost, false, denied, even as a unit in a crowd loses its normal characteristics in the greater mood that sways the whole. The fire no longer burned him, for he was the fire, nor did he stagger against the furious wind, because the wind was in his heart. He moved all over, alive in every point and corner. With his skin he breathed, his bones and tissue ran with glorious heat. He cried aloud, he praised, "I am the whirlwind, and I am the fire, fire that lights that but does not burn, and wind that blows the heart to flame." His body sang it, or rather the elements sang it through his body, for the sound of his voice was not audible, and it was wind and fire that thundered forth his feelings in their crashing rhythm. End of Part 8. Incredible Adventures by Algernon Blackwood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Patrick79. Story 1. The Regeneration of Lord Ernie. Part 9. And so it was that he no longer saw this thing pictorially, nor in the little detached reports the individual senses brought, but he knew it in himself complete, as a man who knows love and passion. Memory afterwards translated these vast central feelings into pictures, but the picture touched reality without containing it. Like a vision, it happened all at once, as a room or landscape happens, and what happens all at once, coming through a synthesis of senses, is not properly describable later. To instantaneous knowledge, mere sequence is a falsehood. The sequence first comes in with the telling afterwards. That kneeling form, he understood, was the empty vessel to which conventional life had hitherto denied the heat and air it craved. The breath of life now poured at full tide into it. The fire of deity lit its heart of touchwood. Wind blew into desire, and later flame would burst forth in action, consuming opposition. He must let it fill to the brim. It was not salvation, but creation. Then thought went out, extinguished by a puff of something greater. For beyond the smoke and sparks, beyond the space the men had occupied, a new and gentler movement, lyrical with bird-like beauty, ran suddenly along the ridge. What Hendricks had taken for branches heaped in rows for the burning stirred marvellously throughout their whole collective mass, stirred sweetly, too, and with an exquisite loveliness. The entire line rose gracefully into the air with a whir as of sweeping birds. There was a soft and undulating motion as though a draught of flowing wind, turned faintly visible, yet with an increasing brilliance, like shining lilies of flame that now flocked forward in a troop, bending deliciously all one way. And in the same second those tall lilies of fire revealed themselves as figures, naked above the waist, hair streaming on the wind, eyes alight and bare arms waving. Above the men's deep-pedalled bass their voices rose with clear, shrill sweetness of the storm. The band swept forward swift as wind towards the kneeling boy. The long line curved about him foldingly. The women took him as the south wind takes a bird. There may have been, indeed there was, an interval, for Hendricks caught, again and again repeated, the boy's great cry of passionate delight above the tumult. Ringing and virile, it rose to heaven, clear as a fine-wrought bell. And instantaneously the knitted figures of flame disentangled themselves again. The mass unfolded like an opening flower, and as by the military word of command, dissolved itself once more into a long thin line of running fire. The women advanced, and the waiting men flowed forward in a stream to meet them. This interweaving of the figures was as easily as accomplished as the mingling of light and heavy threads upon some living loom. Hands joining hands, all singing. These naked worshippers of fire and wind passed in and out among the blazing piles with a headlong precision that was torrential and yet orderly. The speed increased, the faces flashed and vanished, then flashed and passed again. Each woman between two men, each man between two women, and Lord Ernie, radiantly alive between two girls of rich, overflowing beauty. Their movements were undulating, like the undulations of fire, yet with sudden, unexpected upward leaps, as when a fire is partnered abruptly by a cantering wind. For the women were fire, and the men were wind. The imitative dance was in full swing. The marvellous wind and fire ritual unrolled its old-world magic. It was awe-inspiring, certainly, but for Hendricks, as he watched, the terror of big conflagrations was wholly absent. Rather, he felt the sense of deep security that rhythmic movement causes. Bathed in a sea of elemental power, he burned to share the pagan splendour and the rush of primitive delight. He seemed he had a cosmic body in which new centres stirred to life, linking him on this source of natural forces. Through these centres he drew the chaotic energy into nerves and blood and muscle, into the very substance of his thought. indeed transmuting them into the magic of the will. Abundant and inexhaustible vigour filled the air, pouring freely into whatever empty receptacle lay at hand. Sheets of flame, whole separate fragments of it, torn at the edges, raced loudly, hungrily, flapping on the vehement gusts of winds, curved as they flew, leaped, twisted, flashed, and vanished. And the figures closely copied them. The women tossed their bodies aloft, then dipped suddenly to the earth, invisible, till the rushing men urged them into view again with wild, impetuous swing, so that the entire line stretched and contracted like an immense elastic band of life, now knotted, now dissolved. Yet, while of raging and terrific beauty, there was never that mad abandon which is disorder, but rather a kind of sacred, natural revel that prohibited mere licence. There was even a singular austerity in it that betrayed a definite ritual, and not mere reckless pageantry. No walls could possibly have contained it. In cathedral, temple, or measured space, however grand, it could only seem exaggerated and apostate. Here, beneath the open sky, it was beautiful and true, for overhead the stars burned clear and steady, the constellations watching it from their immovable towers, a representation of their own leisured and hierarchic dance in swifter miniature. And indeed, this relationship it bore to a universal rhythm was the key, it seemed, to its deep significance, for the close imitation of natural movements seduced the colossal powers of fire and wind to swell human emotions till they became mould and vessel for the elemental manifestation in men and women. Golden yellow in the blaze, the limbs of the women flashed and passed, their hair flew dark a moment across their gleaming breasts, and their waving arms tossed in ever-shifting patterns through the driving smoke. The fires boiled and roared, scattered torrents of showering sparks like stars, and amid it all the slim, white shoulders of the boy, his clothes torn from him, his eyes ablaze, and his lips open to the singing as though he had known it always, drove to and fro on the crest of the ritual like some flying figure of wind and fire incarnate. All of which, instantaneously yet in sequence, Hendricks witnessed, painted upon the wild night sky. A volcanic energy poured through him, too. He knew a golden enthusiasm of immeasurable strength, of unconquerable hope, of irresistible delight. Wind set his feet to dancing, and fire swept across his face without a trace of burning. Nature was part of him. He had stepped inside. No obstacle existed that could withstand for a single second the torrential energy that filled his heart and blood. There was lightning in his veins. He could sweep aside life's difficult barriers with the ease of a tornado and shake the rubbish of doubt and care from the years of earthquake shocks. Empires he could mould and play with nations, drive men and women before him like a flock of sheep, shatter convention and dislocate the machinery time has foisted upon natural energies. He knew in himself the omnipotence of the lesser elemental deities. Yet, as sympathetic observer, he can but have felt a tithe of what Lord Ernie felt. "We are the whirlwind and we are the fire," he cried aloud with the rushing worshippers. "We are unconquerable and immense. We destroy the lukewarm and absorb the weak, for we can make evil into good by bending it all one way. The roar swept thunderingly past him, catching at his voice and body. He felt himself snatched forward by the wind. The fire licked sweetly at him. It was the final abandonment. He plunged recklessly towards the surge of dancers. End of Part 9.
Incredible Adventures by Algernon Blackwood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Patrick79. Story 1. The Regeneration of Lord Ernie. Part 10. What stopped him he did not know. Some hard and steely thing pricked sharply into him. An opposing power, fierce as a sword, stabbed at his heart, and he heard a little sound quite close to him, a sound that pierced the babel, reaching his consciousness as from far away. "Keep still. Cling tight to this old rock. Hold yourself in, or they'll have you too." It was as if some insect scratched within his ear. His arm that same instant was violently seized. He came down with a crash. He had been half in the air. He had been dancing. "Turn your eyes away, away! Take hold of this big tree!" the voice cried furiously, but with a petty human passion in it that marred the world. There was an intolerable revulsion in him as he heard it. He felt himself dragged forcibly backwards. He lost his balance, stumbling among loose stones. "Loose me! Let me go!" he shouted, struggling like a wild animal, yet vainly against the inflexible grip that held him. "I am the one with the fire that lights but does not burn. I am the wind that blows the world along. Damnation take you! Let me free!" Confusion caught him, smothering speech and blinding sight. He fell backwards, away from the heat and the wind. He was furious, but furious with he knew not whom or what. The interference had destroyed the rhythm, broken it into fragments. Violent impulses crashed through him without the will to choose or guide him, for power had deserted him and flowed elsewhere. He stood no longer in the stream of energy. He was emptied, and at first he could not tell whether his instinct was to return to himself, to rescue his precious boy, or to crush the interfering object out of existence with what was left of him and his raging anger. He turned, stood up, and flung the pastor aside with violence. He raised his feet to stamp and kill, when a phrase with meaning darted suddenly across his wild confusion and recalled him to some fragment of truer responsibility and life. There'll be only violence in him, reckless violence instead of strength, destructive. Save him before it's too late. "It is too late," he roared in answer. "What devil hinders me?" But his roar was feeble, and his ironed boots refused the stamping. Power slipped wholly out of him. The rhythm poured past instead of through him. Interference had destroyed the circuit. More glimmerings of responsibility came back. He stooped like a drunken man and helped the other to his feet. The rapidity of change was curious, proving that the spell had been put upon him from without. It was not, as with the boy, mere development of pre-existing tendencies. "Help me," he implored suddenly instead. "Help me. There has been madness in me. For God's sake, help me to get him out." It seemed the face of the old Marquess, stern and terrible, broke an instant through the smoky air, black with reproach and anger,
and with a violent effort of the will, Hendricks turned round to face the elemental orgy, bent on rescue. But this time the heat was intolerable and drove him back. The hair, hitherto untouched, now singed upon his head. Fire licked his very breath away. He bent double, covering his face with arms and cloak. "Pray!" shouted Leysin, dropping to his knees. "It is the only way. My God is higher than this. Pray! Pray!" And automatically Hendricks fell upon his knees beside him, though to pray he knew not how, for no real faith was in him as in the other, and his eye was far from single. The fast-fading grandeur of what he had experienced still left its pagan tumult in his blood. The pretence of prayer could only have been blasphemy. He watched instead, letting the other invoke his mighty deity alone. That deity he had served unflinchingly all his life with faith and fasting, and with belief beyond assault. It was an impressive picture, fraught with passionate drama. On his knees behind sheltering boulder, a blackened pine tree tossing scorched branches above his head, this righteous man prayed to his God, sure of his triumphant answer. Hendricks watched with an admiration that made him realize his own insignificance. The eyes were closed, the leonine big head set firm upon the diminutive body, the face now lit by flame, now veiled by smoke, the strong hands clasped together and upraised. Oh, he envied him. He recognized, too, that the elements themselves, with all their chaos of might and terror, were after all but servants of the vastness which dips the butterfly in colour and puts down upon the breasts of little robins. And because the pastor's life had always been prayer in action, his little human will invoked the will of greatness, merged with it, used it, and directed it steadily against the commotion of these unleashed elements. Certain of himself and of his God, the pastor never doubted. His prayer set instantly in action those forces which balance suns and keep the stars afloat. Thus, trembling with terror that made him wholly ineffective, Hendricks watched, and as he watched became aware of the amazing change, for it seemed as if a stream of power, steady and in opposition to the tumult, now poured audaciously against the elemental rhythm, altering its direction, modifying gradually its stupendous impetus. There were pauses in the huge vibrations. They wavered, broke, and fled. They knew confusion, as when the prow of a steel-nosed vessel drives against the tide. The tide is vaster, but the steel is different. The whole sky shivered as this new entering force, so small, so soft, yet so much incalculable energy, began at once its overmastering effect. Signs of violence or rout or of anything disordered had no part in it. Excess, before it slipped into willing harness, there was light that sponged away all glare, as when morning sunshine cleans a forest of its shadows. Some little whispering power sang marvellously as of old across the desolate big mountains. Peace, be still, turning the monstrous turbulence into obedient sweetness. And upon his face and hands Hendricks felt faint, delicate touches of some refreshing softness that he could not understand. Yet not instantly was his harmony restored. At first there was stress of vehement opposition. The night of wind and fire drove roaring through the sky. There were bursts of triumphant tumult. but convulsion in them, and no steadiness as before. The human figures hitherto had danced with that fluid appearance which belongs to fire, and with that instantaneous rush which is of the wind, the men increasing the women, and the women answering with joy. Limbs and faces had melted into each other, till the circular ritual looked like a glowing wheel of flame rotating audibly. But slowly, now the speed of the wheel decreased. The single utterance was marred by the crying of many voices, all at different pitch, discordant, inharmonious, dismayed. The fires somehow dwindled. There came pauses in the wind, and Hendricks became aware of a curious hissing noise as more and more of these odd soft touches found his face and hands. Here and there he saw a figure stumbled, fell, then gathered himself clumsily together again with a frightened shout, breaking violently out of the circle. More and more of these figures blundered and dropped out, and although they returned again, so that the dance apparently increased, there were but moments in the final violence of the dispersing hurricane. The rejected ones dashed back wildly into the wrong places. Men and women no longer stood alternate, but in groups together, falsely related. The entire movement was dislocated. The ceremony grew rapidly incoherent. Meaning forsook it. The composite instrument that had transmuted the elemental forces into human, emotional storage was imperfect, broken, out of tune. The disarray turned rout. And then it was, while Leysin continued without ceasing his burning and successful prayer, that his companion, conscious of returning harmony, rose to his feet, aware suddenly that he could also help. A portion of the powers he had absorbed still worked in him, but in a new direction. He felt confident and unafraid. He did not stumble. With unerring tread he advanced towards the lessening fires, feeling as he did so the cold soft touches multiply with the rush upon his skin. From all sides they came, like messengers of help. "Ernest!" he cried aloud, and his voice, though little raised, carried resonantly above the dying turmoil. "Ernest, come back to us! Your father calls you!" And from 80 faces hurrying in confusion through the smoke, one paused and turned. It stood apart, hovering as though in air, while the mob of disordered figures rushed in a body along the ridge, plunging like frightened cattle below the farther edge. Then vanishing into thick darkness, they left behind them this one solitary face. A final dying flame licked out at it. A rush of smoke drove past to hide it. There was a high, wild scream, and the figure shot forward with a headlong leap and fell with a crash at Hendricks' feet. Lord Ernie, blackened by smoke and scorched by fire, lay safe outside the danger zone. And Hendricks knelt beside him. Remorse and shame made him powerless to do more as he pulled the torn clothing over the neck and chest, and heard his own heart begging for forgiveness. He realized his own weakness and faithlessness. A great temptation had found him wanting. It was owing to Leysin that the rescue was complete. The pastor was instantly by his side. "Saved as by water!" he cried, as he folded his cloak about the prostrate body, and then raised the head and shoulders. "Saved by his ministers of rain, for his miracles are love and work through natural laws." He made a sign to Hendricks. Carrying the boy between them, they scrambled down the slope in the shelter of the trees below. The cold, soft touches were then explained. The joran had dropped as suddenly as it rose, and the torrential rain that invariably follows now poured in rivers from the sky. Water, drenching the fires and padding the savage wind, had stopped the dancers midway in their frenzied ritual. It was the element they dreaded, for it was hostile. Rain soused the mountain's ridge, extinguishing the last embers of the numerous fires. It rushed in rivulets between their feet. The heated earth gave out a hissing steam, and the only sound in the spaces where wind and fire had boomed and thundered a little while before was now the splash of water and the drip of quenching drops. In the cover of the sheltering trees the body stirred, lifted its head, and sat up slowly. The eyes opened. "I'm cold. I'm frightened," whispered a shivering voice. "Where am I?" Only the pelt and thud of the rain sounded behind the quavering words. "Where are the others? Have I been away? Hendricks, Mr. Hendricks, is that you?" He stared about him, his face now a mere luminous disk in the thick darkness. No breath of wind was loose. They spoke to him till he answered with assurance, groping to find their hands with his own, his words confused and strange with hidden meaning for a time. "I'm all right now," he kept repeating. "I know exactly. It was one of my big dreams. I suppose I fell asleep, and the rain woke me. Great heavens! Oh, what a night to be out!" And then he clambered vigorously to his feet with a sudden movement of a great energy again, saying that hunger was in him and he must eat. There was no complaint of heat or cold, of burning or of bruises. The boy recovered marvellously. Well, in 10 minutes, breaking away from all support, he led as they descended through the dripping forest in the gloom and chill of very early morning. It was the others who called to him for guidance in the tangled wood. Lord Ernie was in the lead. Throughout the difficult woods he was ever in front and singing. "Fire that lights, that does not burn, the wind that blows the heart to flame, they both are in me now for ever and ever. Oh, praise the Lord of fire and the Lord of wind." And this voice, now near, now distant, sounding through the dripping forest on their homeward journey, was an experience weird and unforgettable for those other two. Leysin, it seemed, had one sentence only which he kept repeating to himself. "Heaven grant he may direct it all for good, for they have filled him to the brim, and he is become an instrument of power." But Hendricks, though he understood the risk, felt only confidence. Lord Ernie's regeneration had begun. Soaked and bedraggled, all three, they reached the village about 2:00. The boy, utterly unmanageable, said an emphatic no to spirits, soup, or medical appliances. His skin, indeed, showed no signs of burning, nor was there the smallest symptom of cold or fever in him. "I'm a perfect furnace," he laughed. "I feel health and strength personified." And the brightness of his eyes, his radiant colour, the vigour of his voice and manner, both in some way astonishing, made all pretence of assistance unnecessary and absurd. "It's like a new birth,"
he cried to Hendricks, as he almost cantered beside him down the road to their house. "And by Jove, I'll wake 'em up at home and make the world go round. I know 100 schemes. I tell you, sir, I'm simply bursting. For the first time, I'm alive." And an hour later, when the tutor peeped in upon him, the boy was calmly sleeping. The candlelight, shaded carefully with one hand, fell upon his face. There were new lines and a new expression in it. Will and purpose showed in the stern set of the lips and jaw. It was the face of a man, and of a man one would not lightly trifle with. Purpose, will, and power were established on their thrones. To such a man the entire world might one day bow the head. If only it will last, thought Hendricks, as shaken, bewildered, and more than a little awed, he tiptoed out of the room again and went to bed. But through his dreams, sheeted in flame and veiled in angry smoke, the face of the old Marquess glowered upon him from a heavy sky above the ancestral towers. End of Part 10. Incredible Adventures by Algernon Blackwood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Patrick79. Story 1. The Regeneration of Lord Ernie. Part 11. From the obituary notices of the 9th Marquess of Oakham, the following selections have their interest. He succeeded to his father, then in the Cabinet as Minister of Foreign Affairs, at the age of 21. His career was brief but singular, the early magnificence of the younger Pitt offering a standard of comparison, though by no means a parallel, to his short record of astonishing achievement. His effect upon the world, first as the Chief of the Government Labour Department, and subsequently as the Home Secretary and Minister of War, is described as shattering, even cataclysmic. His public life lasted 5 years. He died at the age of 29. His personality was revolutionary and overwhelming. For judging by these extracts, he was a Napoleonic figure whose personal influence combined the impetus of Mirabeau and the dominance of Alexander. His authority held an incalculable element, precisely described as uncanny. His spirit was puissant, elemental, his activity irresistible. Yet, according to another journal, he was, properly speaking, neither intellectual, astute, nor diplomatic, and possessed as little subtlety as might be expected of a miner whose psychology was called upon to explain the Trinity. In no sense was he statesman, and even less strategist, yet his name swept Europe, changed the map of the Nearer East, its mere whisper among the chancelleries convulsing men's councils with an influence almost menacing. His enthusiasm appears to have been amazing. Some stupendous and untiring energy drove through him, paralysing attack and rendering the bitterest and most skilful opposition nugatory. His hand was imperious, upsetting with a touch the chessboard set by the most able statecraft, and his voice was heard with a kind of reverence in every capital. The brevity of his astonishing career called for universal comment, as did the hypnotizing effect of his singular ascendancy. In 5 short years of power he achieved his sway. He rushed upon the world, he shook it, he retired, as one journal picturesquely phrased it. The manner of his ending, moreover, a stroke of lightning, seemed to be in keeping with his life. There was neither lingering, delay, nor warning. Of distinguished stock, noble, yet ordinary enough in all but name, his power is unexplained by heredity. His family furnished no approach to greatness, as history supplied no parallel to his dynamic intensity. Nor, we are informed, among his near kin does any inherit his volcanic energy. The world, however, was apparently well relieved of his tumultuous presence, for his influence was generally surveyed as destructive rather than constructive. He was unmarried, and the title went to a nephew. The cheaper journals abounded, of course, in details of his personal and private life that were freely copied into the foreign press, and supply curious material for the student of human nature and the psychologist. The amazing revelations, no doubt, were picturesquely exaggerated, yet the substratum of truth in them all was generally admitted. No contradictions, at any rate, appeared. They read like the story of some primitive, wild giant let loose upon the world. Primitive, because his specific brain power was admittedly of no high order. Wild, because he was in favour of fierce, spontaneous action, and his mere presence on occasions could stir a nation, not alone a crowd, to vehement, terrific methods. His energy seemed inexhaustible, his fire inextinguishable. Legends were rife, even before he died, among the peasantry of his Scotch estates, that he was in league with the devil. His habit of keeping enormous fires in his private rooms, fires that burned day and night from January to December, and in open hearths widened to thrice their natural size, stimulated the growth of this particular myth among those of his personal environment. All manner of stories raged, but it was his strange custom out of doors that provided the diabolical suggestion. For behind a special walled-in place on an open ridge, denuded of pines, in a distant part of the estate, a series of gigantic heaps of wood, all ready to ignite, were, it was said, kept in a state of constant preparedness, and on stormy nights, especially when winds were high, and invariably at the period of the equinoctial tempests, his lordship would himself light those tremendous bonfires, and spend the nocturnal hours in their blazing presence, communing, the stories variously relate, with the witches of their Sabbath, or with hordes of fire spirits who emerged from the bottomless pit in order to feed his soul with the unquenchable supplies. From these nightly orgies it seems clear, at any rate, he returned at dawn with a splendour of energy that no one could resist, and with a mien whose grandeur invited worship rather than inspired alarm. His biography, it was further stated, would be written by Sir John Hendricks, Bart., who began life as private secretary to his father, the 8th Marquess, but whose rapid rise to position was due to his intimate association as trusted friend and adviser to the subject of these obituary notices. The biography, however, had not appeared. Within 5 years of Lord Oakham's sudden death, and curiosity is only further stimulated by the suggestive whisper that it never will and never can appear. End of The Regeneration of Lord Ernie by Algernon Blackwood.